Assalamu alaikum everyone. I hope all of you are doing good. So before we embark on the journey of learning poetry for this semester, I would like to discuss figures of speech with you guys. Some of you might have heard about figures of speech, but it might be new for others. So similarly, the way we have parts of speech in language, we have figures of speech as well. So figures of speech, what are figures of speech, how many types of figures of speech are, and what are their function? We learn all about that today. Okay, so look at this picture and read it. Okay, so these two people, they are speaking. The first one says, say, I'm all ears. Okay, time short runs quick, as fast as an arrow. It's all the beginning of the end for us, ain't it? Yeah, talking me to death, Jean. So there's one thing you would observe about this conversation, that none of the statements, like the way they're speaking, is literally true. For example, he's saying, I'm all ears. We know that he is a person. He is not all ears. Okay, so literally, none of these statements would mean anything. Okay, so because, for example, time sure runs quick. We know time is something, it is an abstract idea and it cannot run, okay, literally. As fast as an arrow, again, it would not be literally true. So because we cannot compare it. But all these ideas, the way we are sharing it, it's a kind of a decorative language, a rhetoric style of speaking in which we understand the meaning by kind of contrasting it with something else or attributing it some human phenomena or something like that. So there could be different types of figures of speech, and in all different figures of speech we assign and work differently. So here are a few names. Okay, metonymy, personification, oxymoron, hyperbole, simile. Okay, so similarly, we would discuss some other in detail. So without any delay, I hope the idea of figures of speech is clear, that by we use figures of speech to decorate the language, okay, to be creative in language. Let's see what's the definition of figures of speech. A figure of speech is a rhetorical device that achieves a special effect by using words in a distinctive way. So there is a distinctive or creative style through which we use different words in language, okay, to achieve a special effect, a creative effect, and it's a rhetorical device. So in poetry especially, but we can also use it in prose sometimes to be creative and to be playful with words. So that's basically the definition of figures of speech. Though there are hundreds of figures of speech, we'll focus on top 20 examples. So there are so many figures of speech, and there is no limitation how you be creative in language. So basically, in creative writing, you can choose any way to play with words. So figures of speech could be anything that you do that does not give us a literal meaning, and a rhetorical device that you can use to decorate your language. Okay, so we would now discuss with the examples of figures of speech which are most commonly used, and then we would also relate them to the examples from the poems that we would be discussing in this semester. Okay, if you know any of the names of figures of speech already, or you have some idea, so you can pause this video and you can comment down with your roll numbers. All right, moving forward, here are a few examples. Okay, so we'll embark and learn about the examples later on, but first let's discuss what are the definitions and how do we can use them. So just a fun fact, figures of speech are also known as figures of rhetoric, figures of style, rhetorical figures, figurative languages, or schemes. So these all could be some names of figures of speech. Okay, so you don't get confused if any of these is used. All right, so let's watch this video first, and because it will give us a general idea and a depiction of how we can use different figures of speech, and it will be creative to understand through examples how different figures of speech could be used. Then we would do and discuss each of them with definitions and with examples. So please pay attention, and you may note down the examples because we would be referring back to them afterwards.
Figures of speech make written and spoken language unique, vibrant, and powerful. There are hundreds to learn from, so let's get started. Alliteration is the repetition of an initial consonant sound in successive words, such as a peck of pickled peppers. It's often used in advertising because it's an effective way to remember slogans. Hyperbole is when you use exaggeration for emphasis. For example, the hamburger was bigger than my head. Irony is the use of words to convey the opposite of the literal meaning. If someone who hated spinach wanted to be ironic, they'd say, "Oh, you know I love spinach." A metaphor is one of the most popular figures of speech. It compares two things that are not alike but have something in common. As Pat Benatar would say, love is a battlefield. An oxymoron places contradictory words side by side. For example, jumbo shrimp. But these few examples are just the tip of the iceberg. There are similes, puns, euphemisms, and hundreds more. Don't worry if you can't remember them all. Language is only a small part of life.
Right. I hope you just got the general idea, because all of the examples that the video provided, they were actually talking about nothing was so literal. Because when I say hamburger is bigger than my head, it cannot be true, or it does not make any sense. But I would be creative with language. Okay. Irony, for example, we use quite often, like being sarcastic. We would say, "I love it." Okay. Or sometimes we also say, okay, this is a very smart act, when referring to a foolish act. Okay, so when we're talking in taking an opposite word, that would be irony, and irony is again commonly used in language, so we might be familiar with that. Okay, so similarly there were other examples, so let's discuss all of them one by one. And I'm sure most of us would already be using these kind of techniques without maybe being aware of the names of such figures of speech. Okay, so without any delay, let's discuss all the figures of speech, and please let me know any common examples that you come across and already use in language. Okay, so first one is alliteration. Alliteration is very common, okay, and some of us, maybe in prose writing or generally non-fiction writing, we use this kind of technique in our sentences to make them, attractive. And as the video mentioned, that alliteration is commonly used for advertisements and slogans. Okay, so for alliteration, the idea is the structure. Let's say when we're talking about a poem, the line of a poem, or when we're talking about prose writing, a particular sentence or few words in a sentence or phrase, okay, they would start with the same sound, same consonant sound, the repetition of initial consonant sound. So here is the example: she sells seashells by the seashore. Okay, this sentence is one of the tongue twisters we might be familiar with. So it's one example, because all of the words in this sentence, they begin with S letter. Okay, and there are repetition of two sounds, basically sh and sa. Okay, so let's not get confused, because we would be mainly focusing on the same sound rather than a letter. Okay, so cells, seashells, and seashore. Okay, so these are like repetition of the same initial sound. So please comment down one example of alliteration if you can come up with, or you can just create few common words that you can use together and write alliteration example, and then so on. There would be good practice. And then when we would be discussing poems, we would see how often alliteration is used. I think it's pretty simple. It does not need further elaboration. If you still have any questions, you can comment down. Okay, next is anaphora. Let me just zoom it a little bit. Okay, so next is anaphora. Anaphora is the repetition of the same word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses or verses. Okay, so we often see that in poetry. If any of you is interested and has been reading poetry, so they might be familiar that sometimes the first word, okay, or a particular phrase is often repeated in successive clauses or successive verses. So, for example, here is an example: unfortunately, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time on the wrong day. Okay, so here the word wrong is used repeatedly. Okay, So it's like repeated in all the phrases: wrong place, wrong time, wrong day. These three phrases, they begin with the same word. Okay. So similarly, we can repeat one phrase for making all the sentences. Let's say, for example, we can say, I am stuck, you are stuck, they are stuck. Okay, so like we try to emphasize the point by repeating something. We can also say like we are stuck in the crisis, but we would say that you are stuck, I'm stuck, they are stuck. So we would try to repeat one word, okay, to emphasize the point. So that would be an example for anaphora. Okay, similarly, you can create some other example in which we are repeating the word, maybe to emphasize something, to make it creative. So there could be multiple reasons, but usually the repetition would be called anaphora. All right, moving forward, we have antithesis. Okay, so as the idea and the name also suggests, that it is the juxtaposition of contrasting ideas. So when we're talking about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, some of you might be familiar with the idea in philosophy, but if not, as the name suggests, it is kind of two contradictory ideas. By thesis, we generally mean idea, okay, the main idea. So when we are saying antithesis, it would mean that two anti ideas, or two ideas which are against each other, they are used together, okay, in a balanced phrases. So let's say, for example, as Abraham Lincoln said, folks who have no vices have very few virtues. So basically, these are true contrasting ideas: folks who have no vices and few virtues. Okay, so these are used together. Similarly, in antithesis, we could use other examples in which we would contrast or put together two ideas which does not generally mean. For example, vices and virtues, these are opposites. So we can use good and bad, okay, um, or tall or short, something like that, with two opposites, but we are using them together and suggesting something else. So being creative with language, we would use such a structure, and that would be called antithesis. All right, next is apostrophe. So don't confuse this apostrophe with the punctuation apostrophe. Uh, Apostrophe is an example for figure of speech as well. Okay, directly addressing a non-existent person or an inanimate object as though it were a living being. So by an apostrophe, we attribute some living qualities to a non-living object. Okay, so for example, there are certain qualities that are particular to living beings or human beings in particular. So something that does not exist or some non-living objects, we associate certain characters to them. For example, oh, you stupid car. Okay, we know that a car is an inanimate object. It cannot be stupid, but we would often say like that. Okay, so that could be one example for apostrophe. You can come up with more examples. You can be creative in any way. So what are some other things? For example, we would say the smart computer. Okay, though computer is like smart, but it's very commonly used, but it's still smartness is an a living being's quality, but often we associate it with inanimate objects. Okay, or similarly, there could be lots of ways we could use this one apostrophe. We very oftenly we use it. So if you can come up with some examples, please type them down in the comment section. Next is assonance. So assonance is the identity or similarity in sound between internal vowels or neighboring words. Okay, so not a complete word or a phrase, but some sounds or some vowels within a word, okay, they kind of resonate with each other. So that is called assonance. So, how now, brown cow? Okay, so often we also use it in tongue twisters. So, because we can observe how now, okay, these are similar kind of sounds, so which are used together, okay, to beautify the language. So that would be called assonance. I'm not elaborating it in much detail because I think it's pretty simple. And I hope you guys would be much clearer with these definitions and with examples. And we would, further put some light on these figures of speech when we would be discussing poetry. Okay, then it would be, further clear. So you don't have to particularly remember all of these, but you should have some idea that what could be some ways in which we could be creative with language. Okay, then we have chasmus and euphemism. Euphemism is very commonly used. Okay, euphemism is the substitution of an inoffensive term for a one considered offensively explicit. So we try to use euphemism when we don't want to be offensive to someone. So there could be, terms which are not considered so appropriate in a society. So for that case, we could use euphemism just to sound nice. Okay, so we try to use less offensive or inoffensive words instead. Okay, you can see the example. Then we have hyperbole. We also discussed this in the video. Okay, so hyperbole is the basically exaggeration. So कोई चीज अगर for example है लेकिन हम उसको जब बढ़ा चढ़ा के थोड़ा सा बताते हैं तो that is basically called hyperbole. I have a ton of things to do when I get home. Like that would mean I have some things to do. Okay, I have some scheduled plan, but I have a ton of things, so it's a kind of exaggeration. Okay, definitely I wouldn't have a ton of some things to do when I get home, so it's kind of an exaggeration. Okay, so बढ़ा चढ़ा के जब हम बात को करते हैं, it is again very commonly used. Irony we already discussed in the video when we're talking about to convey the opposite meaning, being sarcastic, we use irony. Okay, so for example, oh, I love spending big bucks, said my dad on a notorious penny pincher. So that would mean that they would not like to spend much money, but they are being sarcastic, so they're using irony and talking about the opposite or contrasting idea instead. Okay, so the tortoise basically is kind of an understatement in which an affirmative is expressed by negating its opposite. Okay, $1 million is no small chunk of change. So it is kind of already you are giving an understatement, but you're using no. Okay, so trying to negate the meaning and negate its opposite to give the idea. So for example, I would say $1 million is a uh, big amount. Okay, but I'm saying it's no small. So by no small, I would definitely mean it's big. So we are trying to give an understatement by negating its opposite. Okay, so that's called tortoise. Then we have metaphor. Now we have one metaphor, and then we would be talking about simile. So these are kind of related, but there is a like slight difference. So basically, in metaphor and simile, we compare two dissimilar things. Okay, that have something in common. Like all the words is a stage. Okay, so we imply a comparison between world and a stage. Okay, let's see simile first so we don't get confused. Okay, simile is a stated comparison usually formed with like or as between two fundamentally dissimilar things that have certain qualities in common. So in both metaphor and simile, we would compare two dissimilar things. Okay, for example, in the above sentence, the world and stage, they are both different. Okay, so in both simile and metaphor, we would compare or two dissimilar things, but they have one quality in common. So in simile, we would use like or as. Okay, Roberto was white as a sheet. Okay, so we would say, like very often, the cliche example that is given is you are brave as a lion. All right, so like whenever we are comparing two things by the use of these words like or is, that would be a simile. But when we are just comparing by use of is or something like that, that would be a metaphor. Okay, a world, all the world is a stage. Okay, so when we are comparing world and stage, that would be metaphor. Then we have metonymy. a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is substituted for an other which it is closely associated. So, the rhetorical strategy of describing something indirectly by referring to things around it. Okay, so when we use two related terms to describe them indirectly or referring to them, so that would be called metonymy. So, the example is the stuffed suit with the briefcase is a poor excuse for a salesman. Okay, so we are talking about stuffed suit and a briefcase. These are two things which are associated, okay, with the salesman. So these are used together to refer to a general idea about a salesman. So that technique is called metonymy. Okay, onomatopoeia is the use of words that imitate the same sound, okay, of the object or a direct action or a real sound. Okay, so for example, the clap of a thunder. So there's this like clap of a thunder. Okay, went bang and scared my poor dog. So similarly, when we're talking about buzz buzz sound of a bee, or similarly, so all these sounds which are really associated with the actual sounds, or they try to imitate or copy the actual sounds, that would be called onomatopoeia. Okay, then we have oxymoron, in which we use two contradictory terms. They appear side by side. Okay, so we discussed about it in the video as well. So he popped the jumbo shrimp. Okay, jumbo shrimp, two opposite or contrasting ideas, and they are used side by side together. Similarly, paradox is again about contradiction. By the word paradox, it is clear that it talks about some kind of a contradiction. In the beginning, this is the beginning of the end. Okay, so beginning and end, these are two opposite ideas and they contradict, but they are used together. So that would be one example for paradox. By personification, in personification, we would in inanimate object is given some human qualities or attributes. The kitchen knife will take a bite out of your hand if you don't handle it safely. So in kitchen knife, we are giving it a quality of a human being bite out. So biting out is not a quality of knife, but it is a human quality, and we are referring it to a knife. So that would be called personification. Don't get confused with certain figures of speech because some of them are very close in nature, but again there would be some difference. Like we talked about simile and metaphor, we talked about personification. It is again giving the qualities, human qualities or abilities. Okay, so it's kind of an abstraction is endowed. And we also talked about apostrophe. Okay, and in which we were also addressing a non-existent person or an animate object as though it were a living being. So we were just trying to give it an idea that it is a living being, but in personification we are trying to make them living, okay, and giving them an quality of a human being. Okay, so there would be a slight difference likewise. So similarly, don't get confused, and you just have to understand the ways we could be creative in language anyways. All right, moving forward, we have pun. Pun is a play on words, okay, sometimes in different senses of the same word. So we could use one word to give it a different meaning or a different sense, and sometimes a similar sense or sound of a different words. So that's the way we would, play with the language. So let's see, for example, Jessie looked up from her breakfast and said, "A boiled egg every morning is hard to beat." Okay, so this is an example in which she's talking about a boiled egg every morning is hard to beat. So it's like she's trying to be playful with words. Okay, does not literally mean anything, and just being creative and making a resonance in the sounds. We talked about similes already. Then we have synecdoche. Synecdoche is a figure of speech in which part is used to represent whole. So a part of something is used to indicate the whole idea. So for example, we would use ABC to refer to the entire alphabet or entire 26 letters. So ABC is just a part of the entire alphabet. These are three letters only, but we would say quite oftenly ABC to refer to alphabet. So similarly, we could have so many examples in which we would refer a small part to talk about the whole thing. Okay, similarly, we have understatement, the last one discussed in this article. A figure of speech in which a writer or speaker deliberately makes a situation seem less important or serious than it is. We already talked about understatement previously, but that there we were using a negation, okay, with an understatement to give an affirmative sense. Here we would, in understatement, we would, or the speaker or the writer would deliberately use understatement to make it seem less important, okay, or serious than it actually is. You could say Babe Ruth was a decent ball player. Okay, so the reporter said with a wink. So we would say that he's trying to make it an understatement, and it is more of a serious issue than we would try to say it. Okay, so you can refer to more examples, and you can be as creative, but I would really want you कि आप लोग at least 5 to 6 figures of speech के examples comment में करें with your roll numbers, so I make sure कि आप सबको समझ आ गया, and then you can check the work of other people and learn about more creative examples. And if you think someone is mistaken, so if you could politely give them some feedback, and then I would check all of the responses, and then I would tell you whether you are right or wrong. If you have any questions, please let me know, and then we would see or discuss all of these when we would be discussing poetry in detail. So that's it for this lecture. Thank you. Allah Hafiz. Take care.